of D&D, and it's become popular with children anywhere from grammar school on up. Not so with a lot of adults.
It is not like Monopoly. There is no board. It is role-playing, which is typically used for behavior modification.
You're role-playing, you're rehearsing, you're developing the character hour after hour, day after day. We're really talking about intense involvement in a very serious form of violence.
There's a vast movement toward the occult within the cartoon and toy industry. Most people don't realize that 80% of all cartoons deal directly with the occult, and 40% of the toys on the market have occultic influence, and these are the most popular.
It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run.
Some ideas are timeless, and others timely. Yet, I've noticed that the people who address the issues in front of them seem to end up being timeless anyway. That timely person is Giles Hash, someone who saw an opportunity to reconnect and rebuild community in churches through gaming. Giles is the visionary behind Disciple Gaming Ministry, a program designed to bridge the gap between gamers and local churches. Through Disciple Gaming Ministry, Giles is reaching an entire demographic often overlooked in traditional church settings. By integrating tabletop gaming into churches, he's tapping into the passion of gamers and inviting them into a community where they can belong and contribute, all while being discipled. I've been interested in what Giles is doing for close to a year now, so we decided to sit down and talk about how DGM works and what it can mean for the future of discipleship in churches. I honestly walked away from our chat inspired by what Giles is doing and his honest desire to reach all people. Here is this episode's guest, Giles Hash, creator of Disciple Gaming Ministry. Giles, I am so excited to be able to talk to you. For the viewers who don't know, DGM and myself, we go back a little ways. End of 2023, about fall, I get a DM from you kind of talking about this project where you're starting a gaming ministry within your church, and I actually had the privilege of doing the branding for that. And so DGM is a very special thing to me, and I'm excited to be able to sit down with you and actually kind of talk through your heart, your mission, and what DGM is going to bring to the ministry world and how this can kind of revolutionize how we do evangelism. So I'm really excited. Thank you for being here. I want to kick off our conversation by really going back to the beginning. When did you get into gaming? Has it always been a part of your life? Was there kind of this watershed moment where you picked it up and you fell in love? How long has this been a part of your life?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. That's a really loaded question. Do we have like 5 or 6 hours for this interview? I'm just kidding. Short answer is I grew up in the transition era between the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo. My parents got my twin brother and me a Super Nintendo, I think for like our 5th or 6th half birthday. Having a birthday in December means you kind of get gypped on presents sometimes, so they would give us a half birthday present from time to time. And that was my introduction to video games. I remember playing a lot of those games with my brother and occasionally with my dad. But growing up in a conservative church, I was raised either in a Baptist church or IFCA. I'm not sure how many of your viewers are familiar with the IFCA denomination. They're like Baptists, but conservative. My parents didn't necessarily approve of tabletop games, and that wasn't something that I really got into until my 20s, but I did play a lot of video games with my friends, and I was kind of on the nerdier side, reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's fantasy books and a bunch of other really nerdy fantasy Christian authors, and then expanding out into Harry Potter and a couple of other nerdy books in my late teens. And then in my early 20s, I got a job at a Borders bookstore nearby, and some of the coworkers in the coffee shop played Dungeons and Dragons and a couple of other tabletop role-playing games. And I was really interested based on how they were talking about the game nights. I said, hey, I want to join. Is there an opportunity to do that? I still have the first book that I bought. I still use the dice that I got for that first game back in, I think it was 2004 or 2005 is when I started playing. But I got involved in my super late teens, early 20s. And it was it was a revelation to me because I had heard so many stigmatized things about it growing up in a conservative church. And I realized there are some things that should be avoided. It just with any hobby, even in Christian media, there are things that should be avoided, whether it's bad doctrine, bad theology, or just bad practices. But there are things that are of value if you use the tools the way that they can be used, and if you do it in a way that's glorifying to God.
So late teens, you were corrupted, according to some. So during that time, in your childhood, and I mean, you're currently still active in the gaming world. What were some of the games that may have held a special place in your life, and maybe some that even influenced you as a game creator? Anything that is special to you as you look back?
Yeah, there are a few things that really stand out on the video game side. I'm not good at video games. I'll point that out. I'd never had the opportunity to really get into PC gaming. My first computer I got when I was 18, and it was just an off-the-shelf Dell that allowed me to play a couple of games, but I never got good at it. I've always been a console gamer. So on the video game side, games that really stand out were Shenmue 2 that I played on the original Xbox for the GameCube. My brother and I got a GameCube and got the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. That is still one of the best games that I've ever played, and video games that still influence a lot of my focus and a lot of the ideas that I have just for building games and building content for my weekly game sessions now is the Fallout games and Red Dead Redemption 2. On the tabletop game side, the first game that I actually ran was the Serenity role-playing game based off of the movie Serenity, which was the follow-up to the show Firefly. It was put out by Margaret Weiss Productions using the Cortex core rule system. Any viewers who are familiar with indie RPGs, you'll know that that'll be kind of familiar. They've readapted it as Firefly, but it's the same rule system that a lot of TV IPs use to turn into RPGs. So like the Supernatural game, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer game, all of those tabletop games use a similar set of rules from the same company. And then I played a lot of Star Wars with a really good friend, and that's the Star Wars role-playing game that was based off of the Wizards of the Coast 3.5 rules. That was one of the most influential games. The best dungeon master that I ever played with ran that campaign, and that's what I strive to be. Is that young gentleman unfortunately passed away back in 2008, and he died of some complications of a chronic illness. He was only 22, 23, I think. But he ran a game with, I think, 12 of us at the table, which is almost impossible to do. I can handle at most 5 other players. And that's a big thing that influences me is the stories that are in games like Fallout or Legends of Zelda Wind Waker. And then the opportunity to have as many people at the table as possible, laughing, having a good time, and building relationships.
It's hard to beat just the bond that you can build over a shared experience or even a shared story. College, when I didn't have time to game, was probably when I gamed way too much.
Right?
I don't know. It was always like in our room, senior year, there were 3 guys, and it was like, let's finish our assignments so that we can play this game until whatever hour in the morning. But even something as simple as my roommate and I, we ran a Skyrim save of, we were like, you know what, our senior year of college last year, we're going to room together. Let's get a Khajiit that we actually named after a member of our church. the Khajiit named Roger, and we went barehanded the entire way through, and it was just so much fun. You know, you just sit and share those interactions, or playing until like way too late, playing Rocket League together and things like that. And so I want to touch on the community element later, but just you talking about it almost gives me goosebumps, because I know those experiences, and sitting together laughing, you know, whether it's tabletop or video games, it's just a connection that's being built. And I think some of the stigma that surrounded it was maybe a little unfair, but we'll get to that. I do want to ask you a personal question. I noticed in a recent post of yours that you had a figure of Diva from Overwatch.
You got it right here on my desk.
There we go.
And the little one to go inside.
I love it. You had an interest in the Overwatch, esports league, things of that nature, but I want to know who your main was for Overwatch.
It depended on the era. When it was 6v6, I got pretty good with Diva as a dive tank. Near the end of the Overwatch League, before they transitioned to their current esports, I was trying to learn Winston to do some more dive on Monkey because that was the meta. I'm terrible, absolutely terrible at damage characters just because you have to be able to aim. And then if I was playing support, I actually got okay at support. I was pretty good at Mercy, and I did get okay with Kariko on the healing side, but not on the damage side. I haven't played since they released Maga, the Samoan tank. So at that point, I transitioned to a couple of other games. I think I tried the finals, and just that one did not fulfill any desires either. But yeah, Diva was mostly my go-to. I did enjoy Reinhardt, and when I could jump into DPS, I liked playing Symmetra. But for the most part, it was Diva or Winston.
I was always a Roadhog. He's just one of those characters where it's like, gameplay, all that aside, I just liked him as a character. I liked his design. You have a long-standing game tradition, if you will. You've got just these great things like Wind Waker from an artistic perspective, from a gameplay, from a story. I mean, there's just a heritage that if you have any interest in maybe games of the past, current games, which I think there's an argument to be made of, maybe we're losing a little bit of those great story-driven games as we get into like the microtransaction era of gaming.
Yeah, games as a service.
Exactly. So there's a rich heritage there, and that is influencing what you're creating. But as a Christian, you're stepping into this world of tabletop gaming. You are entering an environment that has a stigma surrounding it. And so I want to start by asking, have you had any experience with maybe the Satanic Panic stigma that surrounds it in current day? Has that worn off, or is it still going strong?
I don't think it's worn off. I haven't had any direct contact with it. It's all been stories. So my former podcast co-host, her dad was concerned when my co-host started playing Dungeons and Dragons, because he grew up in the era, like he vividly remembers the Satanic Panic. Two of his daughters play, and he was very concerned that they were going to fall into like demon worship and summoning demons and things like that. It's an odd thing for me because it's a fiction book. You're just as likely to accidentally summon a demon playing Dungeons and Dragons as you are to, as a Christian, accidentally get demon possessed by doing yoga. Again, there are things that we should be careful of and steer clear of, even with things that may seem otherwise innocuous. But there's a fine line to walk when it comes to any kind of moral panic. But directly, I haven't seen any stigma. It hasn't been directed at me, aside from when my parents warned my brother and me to stay away from Dungeons and Dragons when we were in our teens and we were looking at tabletop role-playing games. We were looking more at the Star Wars stuff because we were super into Star Wars at that time, and there were books that were available. They said just be careful because it's tabletop role-playing games, but they didn't think that the stigma extended beyond Dungeons and Dragons. I think they were cool with the Star Wars side of things because it was Star Wars. Star Wars was cool. So no, I haven't directly experienced it, but it is something that I am planning for, just in case there are people who are interested but concerned, and I want to be able to have that conversation with them.
Could you? I don't want to put you on the spot, but could you maybe give your elevator defense of Dungeons and Dragons as a Christian?
There are a couple of things that are worth noting in the kind of the stigma, and I can't remember where the report came out. There was basically a report that came out in the mid to late 90s about the suicidal ideation that happened with Dungeons and Dragons players, and it was a claim that was made by a doctor and a woman. I think it was like Parents Against D&D or something like that. That was definitively disproven over the course of the following 10 years. They presented zero scientific data. Grabbed a couple of anecdotes of people who had some situations that seemed fishy, and they also happened to play Dungeons and Dragons. So my elevator pitch is essentially there's zero scientific evidence to prove that Dungeons and Dragons has a long-term negative impact. And all of the data that has been collected shows that people who play Dungeons and Dragons have a lower suicidal ideation than people who, for example, play in a team sport. The community that's built at the table helps improve their mental health and helps reduce their social anxiety. And if we build a community around that, especially a community that's centered on Christ, playing games is going to be one of the most beneficial things that we can do, just as much as having a regular weekly small group at your house.
I come from a background where if it was like Magic the Gathering, Harry Potter, Pokemon, Dungeons and Dragons, like it was all demonic. And so this is really interesting to me. I always want to know kind of the other side as well. Hypothetically, I don't know if you've had this conversation or not, but you go to an average, they don't even have to be a Christian, but an average D&D player, if you were to ask them or present to them like, hey, do you feel like this is demonic at all? Would they just be shocked? Is it so far from like the culture that you've seen now that you're in it that like, is that connection even there in the minds of players? Are there really any players out there that are even thinking anything about demons or anything like that?
I think it's going to run the gamut. I think it would depend on how aware they are of the Christian culture's stigma. There are so many broad cultural touchstones outside of Christianity from people who are second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth generation non-churchgoers who may have no idea what the cultural stigma had been from the 80s. There's a documentary that's out on, might have been released on Tubi, about a guy who goes by the Geek Preacher. He actually runs the Sunday morning church service for Gen Con, which is it's the biggest gaming convention in the US. It's where most of the game companies do their US premieres of board games and role-playing games. In fact, Dungeons and Dragons, the first place that you can buy the 6th edition books, is going to be at Gen Con this year. He's been playing Dungeons and Dragons since he was a little kid. He had no idea about the stigma when he was a kid because he didn't grow up in a Christian household. I think it's really just going to come down to the culture that the person grew up in. So there's not a hard set answer, in the same way that we wouldn't be able to know if somebody outside of a conservative Christian household would know about the stigma behind rock and roll.
There are people out there that it's just a game. And I think there's a lot that could be said about the Satanic Panic, but I think we may do a little bit more damage than good by trying to sear the conscience of people who, I'm just playing a game. What do you mean I'm summoning demons?
Right.
Like, where did this come from? You see the benefits of community, which is biblical. There's a lot to be said from scripture about why do Christians fellowship together in worship settings, in different settings, because it edifies, it builds up. And you see how community-driven board games and gaming in general can be. So what you've done is you've looked at the positives of D&D. You've seen how it could be better. And now you've integrated Christian ethics, Christian ideas, and really a Christian campaign, if you will, into the D&D world. So would you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now and how you've kind of bridged that gap between maybe the stigma and what D&D can be for churches?
One of the things that I'm passionate about is mental health. There was a game that I listened to for a very long time, especially during COVID, where they were kind of sponsored, or they did a fundraising opportunity for an organization in Washington that uses role-playing games to help kids with social anxiety. It allows them to go through their therapy session and then take risks at the gaming table without having the social ramifications outside of the gaming table. And I thought, why can't we do that with a role-playing game to then figure out how to integrate biblical doctrine into our daily lives. So I invented a game called Royal Priesthood Role-Playing Game. I invented it from scratch for various reasons. One of the game systems that I had looked at, they had a game, or they had a company name that might have carried some of the stigma along with it if I presented it to a more conservative church and said, "Hey, here's this game system that you can adapt for Bible study." Well, that name seems a little fishy, and they have some very inappropriate things on their website as well, things that I don't support, things that I wouldn't want churches to pull away from, and then give up an opportunity for a good resource. So I figured I'll create something from scratch, and we'll go from there. We're then building a game system. I have the game system up and ready to go. It's free to download on my website. That's disciplegaming.com. You don't have to give me any of your personal information. All you got to do is click a check mark that says, yes, I agree that it belongs to you, not to me. You can download the game, you can play it. It has all of the rules built in a single 62-page PDF document, and you can basically create a character, you can get your friends together, and you can build a game campaign based off of a passage in Scripture. That's what I'm focusing on with the ministry on the church-focused side of the gaming ministry. You can go over to the blog on my website and see a game session that I ran inspired by Acts 19. Acts 19 is kind of my mission study, if you will. I'm not sure, Corey, how familiar you are with the concepts behind that passage. Essentially, what we see is a riot in Ephesus as a result of Paul spreading the gospel. And I give it a really good breakdown in one of my blog posts as well. It's something that I preached on extensively. Basically, Paul didn't go into Ephesus to change the culture. He went into Ephesus to spread the gospel. The gospel was spread. People were transformed, and then the culture was changed. That's kind of the opposite of what a lot of practices seem to be in various segments of the, quote, Christian culture community. I have a lot of praise for people that are in the Christian culture community. I grew up in that, grew up in the Christian music industry, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of people in that industry. But when we emphasize change culture so then we can change people and then they can come to God, we're going in the wrong direction. And so I want to start with an Acts 19 perspective and then an Acts 2:42 to 46 perspective, people gathering together in a community to then continue to grow under the, quote, apostles' leadership, which is the leadership that we now have in Scripture.
Tell me a little bit more. I'm curious. So you talk about the way that it's set up. You could pick any passage. Well, I don't know, maybe not like an epistle, but like maybe a more narrative-driven passage. This is formatted to be adapted to a real. I mean, it's customizable, I guess is what I'm asking.
Kind of, yeah. So in the Game Masters section, I do a step-by-step example of how to first exegete and then interpret the book of Ezra, and basically do a campaign, an example of how you could do a campaign of walking your characters, starting out as caravan guards. Let's say theoretically you have caravan guards who need to watch the treasures as they're getting brought from Assyria to Jerusalem to help rebuild the temple. My number one priority with characters is the characters themselves that are playing the game. Whether or not they're stepping into biblical history, they need to be outside of the pages of Scripture, which is why I picked, for example, caravan guards. Your characters should be witnesses to, not influences on biblical Scripture, because canon is closed. Let's not try to change that, but let's experience history at a closer viewpoint than a bird's eye view 2,000-3,000 years later. That's a passionate thing for me. So we can go through the book of Ezra, and I lay it out step by step how to build a plot. You're right, an epistle is difficult. I've been working for about a year on trying to adapt a campaign that is essentially a step-by-step walkthrough of the book of Ephesians, and I'm having to re-exegete Ephesians first to pull out doctrines for each chapter, and then the next step will eventually be, when I get to that point, figure out how to create a storyline that goes along with that. It would be difficult for somebody who's writing a novel about that same type of process. You're building a novel that's inspired by an epistle. It's going to be difficult because there are definitely character arcs and story arcs that can be adapted from an epistle, but it's so much easier with a narrative story. And so, yeah, what you can do with the Game Masters section is walk step by step, and I talk about how to interpret Scripture. The traditionally accepted way to interpret Scripture, going back to the Church Fathers, you'll find out if you get to know me, that I am a fairly traditional, somewhat reformed minister. So my theology, my doctrine, my ideas behind how to interpret and apply Scripture will fit in line with most Baptist Presbyterians. We might have some disagreements on minor issues, but how we should be teaching the Word of God is going to follow those processes. And so it's going to be a crash course. It's a 2-hour crash course, essentially, on how to build a game session. And then I teach you how to create the game session and how to get your players to walk step by step through the story itself, building challenges that allow them to interact with the story and build character development so that way it feels personal to them.
Okay, this is incredible. Like I'm loving every bit of this, because what you're creating at the front end is even a Bible study resource of somebody.
That's my passion. It's a Bible study, and it has to be a Bible study. So if it's not a Bible study first, everything else falls apart.
We don't have to name names, but there's a lot of there's a lot of debate around certain Christian content, because that line between, could this have been better as historical fiction, like you're describing, maybe an outsider looking in, rather than trying to rewrite from the perspective of real people. And there's a lot of debate in the Christian community about that. But this is really interesting, because you could approach someone and start with the angle of, hey, this is first and foremost a Bible study resource with the game attached to it. And I mean, I haven't heard of anything like this. I mean, when we think of Christian gaming, I mean, there were those old NES games.
Right.
Like
I had a Game Boy version.
Exactly. But this is really revolutionizing. And so now I'm curious, you're stepping into real historical events. So a lot of people, when they talk about Dungeons and Dragons or like role-playing games, they are thinking more fantasy. So I'm curious, kind of, what is your approach to building that world? You're obviously pulling from very concrete, like, source material. Like, we know Jerusalem was like this at this time when they're rebuilding these things. So how much room do you leave for creativity as the campaign progresses? Or is it very much so, hey, as we go through this, we're living as though we're in the real world with real moral obligations? Kind of, how does that look as you do a campaign?
That'll really depend on the person that's using it. My intent for, if you use the RP2 system, or if you adapt the philosophy and use another system that allows you to be super creative. So there are a lot of other systems out there. One of them is called Fudge, where basically all it gives you is, here's the math behind the dice. If you want your players to do X, they have to roll Y and then result Z. So there are a lot of systems out there, and the dungeon, or the game master section of RP2 is specifically designed to allow you to build a campaign using the RP2 set, or B, take the philosophies behind building the campaign and then adapting the game system of your choice to do that. If you're using the system directly as a Bible study, I always suggest stick as close to the history and biblical principles as possible. If you want to do a fantasy setting, maybe spend a little less time focusing on the historical side and more time on the application side. So let's say we want to do a Bible study on the book of Ephesians. We talk about, let's say, Ephesians 1 through, I think, 5 is the first chunk that's broken out, depending on your translation. That's a good solid passage where you can get some good doctrine. Talk about that 15, 20 minutes, and then say, okay, now we're going to step our characters into this world that we've developed as a community, and it's going to be a fantasy setting. Let's say you want to use Dungeons and Dragons. So my recommendation would be restrict some of the classes, any of the classes that get their powers through non-God sources. Make sure that those are only available for bad guys. And then at the table, when they're making decisions, make sure that they're rewarded for using and applying the doctrines that you learned in the Bible study. And then they're facing some kind of story, character, consequence for either failing to or doing something that is the exact opposite of that. An example that I have once a month on, I think it's typically the first Monday of the month, but it depends on who's available. I'm running a campaign with a bunch of other Christian husbands. It's specifically a chance for Christian husbands to get together to just build community and relationships. It's played in the Dungeons and Dragons rule setting, but I'm creating a monotheistic world where all of the supernatural powers come from what are essentially saints that are more inspired by the Valar from Tolkien's Silmarillion. So if you think of Iluvatar from the Silmarillion and his relationship with the Valar, those are the power structures that give each individual their focus, similar to saints. If you were to create fantasy around the Catholic saints, so you have a patron of just warriors, a patron of study, patron of healing, things like that. And then warlocks are off limits because warlocks get their powers from demonic pacts. And that's the setting that we're going through. All of the characters are going to face consequences if they do something that would be restricted by the Bible. So if a character wants to rob a local orphanage, yeah, they're going to face a lot of character consequences and story world consequences. So we're gonna promote that, and that's how you can kind of adapt it depending on the direction that you want your game group to go.
I love this, man. Like, I'm getting excited. I was talking to a buddy the other day about a certain show, and I was just telling him, I was like, man, I cannot stand it because the main characters never have consequences. Like it's like they could literally commit a heinous act, and because the writers are on their side, they'll find a way to get out of it. And it's just like, oh yeah, whatever. These people had this happen to them because of their actions, but they're the main character, so we just kind of move on. And what you're talking about is so important, because I've heard Christians talk about how they get into D&D, and like that's not the issue, but they talk about it and they're like, man, I love it so much because I can just do whatever I want and just kind of go crazy. And I think this is true in video games and things like that, where you mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2. What a sandbox to really go one of two ways, and you can commit heinous acts or you can be a good guy.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important as Christians to really try to bring, like you're saying, bring the gospel into wherever we're going. And I appreciate that the worlds you're creating, and correct me if I'm maybe phrasing this poorly, but it sounds like you're building worlds, no matter how far into fantasy they are, there's still gospel there, if that makes sense. Of, we may be talking about getting powers from this being, and, I have the power of, like, I'm a good warrior, or I have the power of study, but it still operates under the rules as though the gospel is real. And I mean, that's so incredible. And add the Bible study element to it, whether you're doing a historical piece from scripture or you're kind of building out this world like you're describing, that's just so incredible that the gospel and the ramifications of real life, objective, universal morality, it's still there. Like, this is so incredible. I guess I want to maybe get your advice to somebody is wanting to start this campaign. Let's say they're going the fantasy route. They're good on, yeah, we're not going to do warlocks. Like, we're not going to go that route. But they've got some players who are like, at every turn, they want to do the most, rambunctious thing of like, oh, look at this person, let's rob them. What would be your advice to a game master to kind of, because, okay, it's in the name, discipleship is a part of the ministry that you're doing. What would be your advice to a game master to kind of help disciple the players, to keep them on track and help them kind of grow in their sanctification, maybe even by proxy of this character that they're playing as?
My suggestion, and it's something that I've done in a game that I run with some non-Christians as well. In Dungeons and Dragons specifically, you have character alignment. They've modified it a bit over the years, but essentially your alignment defines how you are morally. And if let's say somebody wants to steal from somebody who's innocent, or just steal from a merchant, or just steal in general, ask them what their alignment is and let them know if you do that, it's going to affect your alignment. How you are perceived, what your moral compass is going to change. And you can see that in your own life. People who start to cave to morality, they change as a person. If you engage in acts of lust, for example, your relationship with your spouse starts to suffer, your relationship with your friends starts to suffer, and your relationship with other people in general starts to suffer because you start allowing sin to become okay. And if you do that in a game world, your character is going to start having direct consequences. So you let them know, hey, if you're going to steal from that person, it's going to have real world consequences, and it's going to change who you are as a person. Whether they get caught or not isn't the critical part. So you let them know, hey, there could be consequences. If you want to get more subtle with it, make them roll for it. And then make sure that eventually they start getting caught, and make sure that more and more dire consequences come out of the woodwork. In Skyrim, you mentioned Skyrim earlier. I was playing a playthrough years ago, and I thought, hey, I'm not visible to this character. Let me steal a ruby from this chest, just because I could. And I think 2 hours later, some kind of assassin came and tried to take me out. And it turns out that I still got caught, even though nobody saw me take it. They had put a hit out on my character because I had stolen something. And that was just a minor thing in game. It was like a ruby, something that was worth, I think, 10 gold. So in game, there can be consequences, and you can get really subtle with it. You can get really blunt with it, and it does depend on the gaming group. Just have that conversation. If they want to play a game where they're going to play an evil character, maybe it's time to have a conversation on what's going on with them as a person, and determine, hey, is this a deeper theological conversation? And it's also going to come down to what your role is in that community, in that group, and with that individual. Because if you're not necessarily in a position to be an official spiritual leader like I am with my church, then maybe there's a different type of conversation that's going to have to be had. It's a great question, but I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, because it does come down to the community and your relationship with them.
Man, what you're describing is just incredible. And I kind of want to shift into, what do you see down the road for gaming becoming more and more just day-to-day practice for churches? I think it depends, but for men specifically, community usually looks like, hey, let's go get a cup of coffee, sit and talk about how work is going, and that's about it, and kind of go home. And ministry looks different and community looks different, but that's not for everybody. Sitting and talking about their 9 to 5. I will speak personally. When I'm not working my 9 to 5, I don't typically like to sit and talk about my 9 to 5.
Right.
But creating this environment where community is being built, I guess I want to ask, one, you see the positives. What are some of the barriers that you feel like you're going to have to break down for churches to start seeing the positives first? What would be some of those barriers that you're anticipating?
I think at the moment, the biggest barrier I've seen is the people who are interested and as excited about it as you are, if not even more so. They don't know how to make it work effectively for their community. The role-playing game side of things, like I mentioned earlier, the biggest table that I've managed to handle successfully has been about 6 players. So that's 7 of us at a table. If you have 7 people doing something for 4 hours, that can be a very limited amount of time. Each person has to have their own time to shine. Otherwise, somebody's going to feel really left out. And so we're not talking about a giant draw. The church as a corporation type of butts in seats focus, I get it, from a church to be able to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, pay to repave the parking lot, pay the salary of the people who have to run the place. They have to have a specific mission to maintain that. They have to have giving to bring that in. And gamers do they do fall on a wide spectrum of social status. You got people like John Manganiello, who's a very famous actor, Matthew Lillard from SLC Punk, and Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. Big actors, big names. Macaulay Culkin is another big example of celebrities with a lot of money who could contribute to the community, all the way down to people who are borrowing books from their friends because they can barely afford a $10 set of dice. So that's not a big draw for a church to bring people into their community for a 6-person small group. So the biggest barrier right now is figuring out how to get past that. Well, we don't know how to integrate it to bring value to the community as a whole. And this isn't a criticism; it's an observation, because I get it too. I host a house church. Our church ranges from 5 to 7 people, oftentimes, just because the dynamics of a community that's not associated with an international denomination. We are affiliated with an organization that is big and passionate about equipping non-denominational churches, and we do have, like I said earlier, very traditional, fairly reformed theology, but our methods aren't what everybody's used to. The community's mostly teaching focused and conversational. So yeah, it doesn't even work for our community in the same way that somebody would want a big draw. Getting back to the specifics of your question, gaming in general, people have been doing LAN parties for youth group for years. One of my old youth pastors, he had a Call of Duty night back in the mid 2000s where everybody would bring their computer. They had 200 people playing Call of Duty together. There was a period there where they had a bunch of Xboxes on staff, just on hand, and they do Halo night. They'd have a bunch of 16 versus 16 tournaments. And on the gaming side of things for video games, there are entire ministry organizations out there that exist that are building a lot of momentum. There's a group in Salem, Oregon, called Satellite Gaming. This weekend, as of this recording, they're actually in Colorado Springs setting up a second office. They do esports with local schools. They're integrated with after-school programs, spreading the gospel and playing games together and building esports leagues. There's a group called Love Thy Nerd that is developing an organization called the Nerd Culture Ministry Collective, and they're doing a big conference. This is their second year doing the conference, and specifically focusing on the video game side of things, where they're doing live stream video games. They're doing church chats while they play video games. So they're like sitting around like fishing in World of Warcraft or something and having theological conversations to draw people in. That's something that churches can do to build a big draw. But again, it comes down to convincing them that there is value beyond the monetary, because every single person who comes into your church is an important person, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a giant influx of people to be worth your time. But at the same time, as somebody who withheld from volunteering for church for so long, I know how hard it is to get people to volunteer to run a program like this. Even running a role-playing game, let's say you have one person who's interested in doing this in your church, and let's say you get somebody interested in leadership who says, yes, I think that's awesome if you take it on. You do a role-playing game weekly or bi-weekly Bible study that's going to go up on our church's website, as this is one of our small groups that we have available. Even if you get to that point, then getting other people interested to show up is still going to be a challenge. So it's so many barriers, and it's the types of barriers that churches have been facing for years. How do we get people interested? How do we demonstrate to the skeptics that it's valuable? How do we balance the need with the people who are going to leave as a result of something like this? And I don't know how to answer any of those questions beyond God calls us to make disciples of all nations, and that includes gamers. So we got to figure something out. And here's my idea of a potential solution.
So my background is definitely more reformed, Reformed Presbyterian, and I think we may have a flaw on the more reformed side of, we're very big about hard work, that reformed tradition of we work hard, we glorify God, and, putting our hand to the plow. And the approach to things like video games or gaming in general is that it has no real world value. And that's kind of been the key word of value.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your response to a church of, they're asking you like, hey, this is all fake, this is all make-believe, how is this actually going to be valuable in the real world? So what would be kind of your short response to, hey, this is what makes this valuable? And I feel like I know the answer, but
Right.
I would like to know from you.
So from the tabletop gaming side of things, we've been talking about it the entire time. It's community. When you build community, just look back at Acts 2 and Acts 4. Two very short passages, but basically the church grew specifically because of the community time that they spent together learning about God. That is the value. And one of the things that I talk about with our church, even though we are small in numbers, our growth spiritually, it's something that's applicable to our everyday lives. So we may not be growing in church community size, but our spiritual growth is still going strong. So we are growing spiritually, even if we're not growing by the numbers. If you want to talk about value on the video game side of things, and I just looked this up yesterday, there had been a couple of things that had come up about the churches can't avoid video games. In 2022, I believe it was $320 some billion in global video game revenue, which is more than quadruple the combined industry revenue for the global music and global movie industry. Video games are the number one media industry in the world by an order of magnitude. Call me on the math. I don't know the mathematical terms, but video games are literally the number one media industry in the world, and it dwarfs all other industries. And like I said, movies and music combined can't even come close. You throw book publishing in there, you're still not going to come close. So it's out there. 50 million people in 2019 were playing Dungeons and Dragons. That didn't even account for the incredible spike in growth of people who were playing during COVID because they were able to suddenly have time to play online. There was interest because of games like Critical Role, which did their Campaign 3 premiere in theaters. Over 1 million theaters around the world, I think, playing live in front of millions of people who went to theaters to watch 7-ish voice actors play this game online. The Dungeons and Dragons movie was a box office phenomenon. The Critical Role cartoon on Amazon Prime is wildly successful, wildly popular, an award-winning TV show. It's culturally relevant. People are doing it in the millions, and the value is there because there are people playing it. And so we need to figure out how to reach people without cheapening it and without trying to take it over and colonizing it. I think the Christian media industry has some really good things that they've done, but some things that also they're a cheap parody of what is high quality media, if that makes sense. And so the value is there, but we need to pursue it in the right way because yeah, there's millions, if not billions, of people playing it. Literally half of the global population plays video games these days. And so if we see that there's no value in gaming and no real world value in gaming, well, the real world value is in the souls that are in need of saving. And so it's our responsibility to make disciples of all people. And if we start cutting out people who are playing games, it's going to be a higher and higher percentage as people who are technologically illiterate or technologically uninterested start to die off.
It's just so interesting because we're so comfortable with like, oh yeah, Christian movies. We love those and we love Christian music, but Christian gaming, it makes us uneasy for some reason. I find it strange. But the thing that comes to mind is that even preaching itself is referred to as foolishness in, you know, what we do. Just the fact that we as humans get to play any part in the spreading of the gospel by any means is so, like, we're just so finite and silly. So I just think it's funny, you know, for us to say, you know, this way of sharing the gospel is lesser than this way of sharing the gospel. It's there. The opportunity is there. And so to kind of recap, the value is you're getting community and you're reaching souls that are otherwise lost. And I think that is extremely, extremely valuable and should be valuable to churches. So I'm really excited for what you're doing. A couple of questions about the game itself as far as implementation. So how many people do you need to do one of your campaigns?
My suggestion is 3 to 6. But if you have a game master and at least 2 players, you can get it done. The fewer players, well, if you have fewer than 3 and more than 6, there is going to be a learning curve in figuring out how to make that happen. But if you have people who are involved and invested and willing to go through the learning process with you and are patient, I think at least 3 people. 2 people just gets, you might as well just, my recommendation, if it's just 2 people, is focus on Bible study together. Pick a book of the Bible to study, maybe find 2 or 3, maybe 4 commentaries to read through alongside that, and start there rather than building the game. But for the actual game, start getting 2 to 4 players, maybe 5 players, and then 1 game master. That's kind of the ideal game group.
And is this something that could be executed like virtually? Like we're sitting on a call right now. Could 6 people get together on a call like this and go through one of your campaigns?
Absolutely. The game itself is designed specifically. The term in the gaming industry is theater of the mind. So any movement and combat that would happen in a game setting, you describe in vague-ish terms, assuming that everybody's able to do what they need to do in a specific area. If you go over to my website, there's a video on the blog of basically a demo that I ran for a group called Safe Point Ministries. They specifically exist to connect nerds to nerd-friendly churches and help churches build nerd-friendly programs. I did a demo on their live stream and posted the video from their YouTube. So it's embedded on there. You can see me run them through a campaign, and it was all virtual. I think only 2 of them were in Oregon where they're based, and then the other 2 members were in other states around the country. So it is something that's totally virtual and able to be done across the globe if you have people who have an internet connection.
That's huge. And to get started, it costs absolutely nothing.
$0. Yeah, and if you want me to train your church staff, let's say you want to implement like 5 groups and you want five leaders to come in, I have a contact form on the website. Reach out and we'll talk about how to do training. I have a specific cost in mind, but it's not posted on the website because I also understand budgets are a thing. So don't let your budget be an issue. Give me a ring and we'll figure out what you need from there.
Man, what a heart for local churches. Like, it's just a part of the very identity of what you're doing, and I love it. Let's let the viewers know where you can be found, where you want to be found, and let's get this thing going. Let's get it out there. I'm so excited about it.
Easiest place to find me is over on disciplegaming.com. There are links to all the socials. X, I believe it's disciple_GM. And then on Facebook and Instagram, it's disciple.gm. I didn't want to get something super long. Like I said, disciplegaming.com. And all of my contact is available there.
Well, Giles, thank you so much for taking time to sit down and talk to me. This is just incredible. I'm excited, and I want to go and learn more about this. I am probably the least qualified person to do anything like this, but I'm just so excited because what you're doing, it's new, it's innovative, and it is just so pure, and it's there to help churches and help people. And so, I mean, how could I not be excited about this? This is awesome.
Right.
So thank you again for taking time. And I mean, I would love to see what we could do in the future with one of your campaigns. I just think this is awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. If you have a bunch of other former guests who want to do like a live stream, we'll do a live stream of a campaign session. Maybe not some of the more theologically focused ones, unless they want to call me out on my really shoddy philosophy, or not philosophy, theology. No, actually what happened? Okay. It'll be a great learning experience for me too. But yeah, I'd be more than happy to come on and do a game. We can talk off camera about some ideas too. Be more than happy to continue to work together on ministry stuff.
All right, everybody, keep your eyes peeled because I'm excited about this. Well, Giles, thank you again, and I think we'll be talking in the future.
Wonderful.